I never imagined the betrayal would happen under my own roof. The day my best friend came to stay with us, I thought I was helping her through a tough time. But then, one late night, I overheard whispers from the living room, my husband's voice, followed by hers. My heart raced as I crept closer. What I saw next shattered my world. Sarah and Ethan had always been the couple people admired. High school sweethearts turned partners for life. They seemed inseparable. Ethan was a charming entrepreneur, always quick with a joke or a reassuring hug. Sarah, on the other hand, was the kind-hearted planner who thrived on creating a cozy home for their little family. Their lives were far from perfect, but their bond felt unbreakable, or so Sarah believed. Things had been hectic lately. Ethan's business demands kept him away more than Sarah liked, and she often found herself alone, missing the easy laughter they used to share. When her best friend Lisa called one evening in tears, Sarah didn't hesitate to offer help. Lisa had just ended a messy relationship and needed a place to stay for a while. "I'll just be here until I figure things out," Lisa promised, her voice wavering with emotion as she stood in Sarah's doorway, a single suitcase in hand. "Stay as long as you need," Sarah replied warmly, hugging her. Lisa had been there for her during some of her darkest days. It was only right to return the favor. At first, the arrangement worked well. Lisa was careful not to intrude, helping Sarah around the house and sharing wine-fueled late-night conversations that reminded them both of simpler times. Ethan, too, was welcoming, although Sarah noticed a certain unease in him. She chalked it up to the stress he was under. But then, little things began to shift. Sarah couldn't put her finger on it. Ethan's lingering looks when Lisa was in the room, Lisa's subtle changes in demeanor when Ethan was around. A misplaced joke, a laugh that sounded just a bit too intimate. It was nothing Sarah could prove or even confront, but the seeds of doubt were planted. Sarah tried to shake it off. "They're just being friendly," she told herself. Yet, she couldn't ignore the quiet tension that seemed to build every time the three of them were together. She wanted to trust them, needed to trust them. But the uneasy feeling gnawed at the edges of her mind, leaving her restless and uncertain. And then came that fateful night. Sarah couldn't pinpoint the exact moment when things started feeling off, but the unease settled like a dark cloud over her once happy home. It was subtle at first, Lisa's laughter echoing just a bit louder when Ethan told one of his stories, the way his eyes would linger on Lisa a fraction too long during dinner conversations. Sarah dismissed it as overthinking, brushing off her instincts. "They're just getting along," she told herself. "Lisa needs support, and Ethan is just being his usual friendly self." But the uneasy feeling only grew stronger. One evening, Sarah came home earlier than expected from her yoga class. She heard the faint sound of laughter from the living room and paused, her hand hovering over the doorknob. The tone of their voices was intimate, closer than she expected. Slowly, she pushed the door open to see Ethan sitting on the couch, his body turned toward Lisa, who was perched casually on the armrest. The way they leaned into each other felt different. "Oh, Sarah, you're home early," Lisa exclaimed, her smile faltering for a split second before she quickly recovered. Ethan glanced at her with what Sarah could only describe as a guilty expression, though he said nothing unusual. "Yeah, class ended early," Sarah replied, forcing a smile. She moved into the room and took a seat, but the tension lingered like an unwelcome guest. Over the next few weeks, Sarah began noticing more red flags. Ethan's phone, once carelessly left on the kitchen counter, was now always in his pocket. His late-night work sessions seemed to stretch longer than ever, and Sarah couldn't ignore the way he and Lisa exchanged quick, knowing glances when they thought she wasn't looking. One night, unable to suppress her growing paranoia, Sarah decided to check Ethan's phone while he showered. Her hands trembled as she unlocked it, her heart pounding against her ribs. She didn't find anything incriminating at first, just harmless texts and work emails. But then, tucked away in a muted conversation thread, she found a photo Lisa had sent, a seemingly innocent selfie, except for the flirty caption beneath it. "Missing our late-night talks. Hope you're thinking of me, too." Sarah's stomach churned as she stared at the screen. Her mind raced, alternating between disbelief and a sinking certainty that something was deeply wrong. She wanted to confront Ethan immediately, but hesitated. What if she was jumping to conclusions? What if she was wrong? From that moment, Sarah began observing them more closely. She noticed how Lisa seemed to anticipate Ethan's moods, offering him a comforting touch on the arm or a perfectly timed laugh. Ethan, in turn, seemed unusually attentive to Lisa, always quick to pour her wine or grab her coat. One Saturday morning, as Sarah sipped her coffee on the patio, she overheard their voices drifting from the kitchen. The tone was low, almost conspiratorial. "I can't keep doing this," she heard Ethan mutter, his voice heavy with frustration. "Relax," Lisa replied smoothly. "She doesn't suspect a thing." Sarah's grip tightened on her coffee mug as her heart dropped. She felt her chest constrict with a mix of anger, hurt, and betrayal. Though they stopped talking the moment she stepped into the kitchen, the look on their faces said everything. "Is everything okay?" Sarah asked, trying to sound casual. "Of course," Ethan replied quickly, his tone too bright to be genuine. Lisa avoided her gaze, suddenly fascinated by the mug in her hands. That night, Sarah lay awake, replaying every moment in her head. Her mind screamed for clarity, for the courage to confront the situation head on. But she was afraid of what she might uncover, and even more afraid of what it would mean for the life she had so carefully built. The cracks in her once perfect world were growing, and Sarah could no longer ignore them. The days that followed were a blur of tension and unease. Sarah found herself hyper-aware of every interaction between Ethan and Lisa, her mind a whirlwind of doubts and questions she couldn't bring herself to ask. She wanted to confront them, to demand answers, but the fear of what she might hear held her back. It was late one evening when the line between suspicion and reality began to blur irrevocably. Ethan had gone out for a supposed work meeting, leaving Sarah and Lisa alone in the house. Sarah sat in the living room, her laptop perched on her knees as she tried to focus on some overdue work. Lisa entered the room, her steps unusually hesitant. "Want some wine?" Lisa asked, holding up a half-empty bottle. Her tone was casual, but Sarah couldn't ignore the strange look in her friend's eyes. "Sure," Sarah replied, setting her laptop aside. Maybe a drink would help calm the storm in her mind. They sat across from each other, the air heavy with unspoken words. Lisa seemed restless, fidgeting with her glass and avoiding Sarah's gaze. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. "Is something on your mind, Lisa?" she asked, trying to sound nonchalant. Lisa froze for a moment, then let out a nervous laugh. "No, not really. Just a lot going on, I guess." Sarah studied her carefully. There was something almost fragile about Lisa tonight, a vulnerability that felt out of place. Before Sarah could press further, the sound of Ethan's car pulling into the driveway made them both jump. Lisa quickly stood up, mumbling something about going to bed, but Sarah caught the flicker of panic in her eyes. Ethan walked in moments later, his tie loosened and his expression weary. Late night? Sarah asked, her tone sharper than she intended. Yeah, sorry, Ethan replied, avoiding her eyes as he kissed her on the cheek. It was a long meeting. That night, as Sarah lay in bed beside Ethan, she couldn't stop replaying Lisa's odd behavior. Something about the way she had acted tonight felt different, almost as if she were carrying a secret too heavy to bear. The following morning, Sarah decided to confront Ethan indirectly. You've been working late a lot lately, she said casually over breakfast. Is everything okay at work? Ethan hesitated, his fork hovering midair. Yeah, just a busy season, he replied, a little too quickly. Lisa walked in at that moment, her hair still damp from a shower. She gave Ethan a quick smile, and Sarah noticed the way his eyes softened as he looked at her. The tension reached a boiling point a few nights later. Sarah had gone to bed early, exhausted from another day of pretending everything was fine. She woke in the middle of the night to the faint sound of voices coming from downstairs. Quietly, she slipped out of bed and tiptoed toward the staircase, her heart pounding in her chest. Peering through the banister, she saw them. Ethan and Lisa stood in the kitchen, their faces close as they whispered urgently. The way Ethan reached out to touch Lisa's arm, the way she leaned into him, it was undeniable. Ethan, this is too much, Lisa whispered, her voice trembling. I know, Ethan replied, his tone laced with frustration. But I can't just stop. You mean too much to me. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She felt frozen, her legs unable to move as she watched the scene unfold. You don't understand how hard this is for me, Lisa said, tears glistening in her eyes. I don't want to hurt her. I don't either, Ethan said, his voice barely audible. But I can't keep lying to myself. This, whatever this is, it's real. Sarah felt like the ground had been pulled out from beneath her. Her mind screamed at her to storm into the kitchen, to demand answers, but her body wouldn't move. She backed away silently, retreating to her room with tears streaming down her face. The next morning, Sarah decided to confront Lisa. She waited until Ethan had left for work, then cornered Lisa in the living room. Is there something you need to tell me? Sarah asked, her voice trembling with barely contained anger. Lisa looked startled, her eyes widening as she stammered, What do you mean? You know exactly what I mean, Sarah said, her voice rising. I saw you with Ethan last night. I heard everything. Lisa's face crumpled, and she sank into the couch, burying her face in her hands. I didn't mean for this to happen, she sobbed. I swear, Sarah, I never wanted to hurt you. Sarah felt a wave of nausea wash over her. So it's true, she whispered, her voice barely audible. How could you? After everything we've been through. Lisa looked up at her, her face streaked with tears. It wasn't supposed to be like this, she said desperately. I tried to stop it, but I don't know how. Sarah's world shattered in that moment. The betrayal was no longer just a suspicion. It was real, and there was no escaping it. The air in the house felt suffocating. Sarah's confrontation with Lisa had left her shattered, yet she couldn't bring herself to confront Ethan. She needed more. Proof, answers, or perhaps just the courage to face the truth she already knew. That evening, Sarah decided to wait. She stayed up after Ethan went to bed, scrolling through his social media accounts and emails on their shared laptop. At first, everything appeared normal, but then she stumbled upon an unfamiliar email account saved in the browser. Her fingers trembled as she clicked it open. The inbox was filled with messages from Lisa. Each one was a dagger to Sarah's heart. They were casual at first, plans for errands, inside jokes. But then, They became more intimate. Last night was incredible. I can't stop thinking about you. I feel guilty every time I see her, but I don't want to lose this. Do you ever think about what it would be like if it were just us? Sarah's stomach churned as tears blurred her vision. It wasn't just a suspicion anymore. The truth was staring her in the face, and it was uglier than she'd imagined. The next morning, Sarah confronted Ethan. She stood in the kitchen, holding the printed emails in her trembling hands. "We need to talk," she said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. Ethan froze, his coffee cup halfway to his lips. "About what?" he asked, his voice casual but his eyes wary. "These," Sarah replied, slamming the papers onto the counter. Ethan's face drained of color as he picked up the pages. "Sarah, I can explain," he began, but she cut him off. "Explain what? That you've been sneaking around with my best friend? That you've been lying to me while she's been living under our roof?" Her voice cracked, but she refused to let the tears fall. "I never wanted to hurt you," Ethan said, his voice soft, almost pleading. "It just happened." Sarah laughed bitterly. "It just happened? Do you hear yourself, Ethan? You didn't trip and fall into an affair. You made a choice, 1,000 choices, to betray me." At that moment, Lisa walked into the kitchen, unaware of the storm she was stepping into. "Good morning," she said, her cheerful tone faltering as she saw Sarah's tear-streaked face and the papers in Ethan's hands. "What's going on?" Lisa asked, her voice trembling. "Why don't you tell me?" Sarah snapped, turning to face her. "Or should I go first?" Lisa's face turned pale. "Sarah, she began, but the words failed her. "Save it," Sarah said, her voice icy. "I already know everything." The room fell into a heavy silence. Ethan and Lisa exchanged a glance, and the unspoken connection between them was like a slap in the face to Sarah. "How long has this been going on?" Sarah demanded. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "A few months," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "A few months?" Sarah repeated, her voice rising. "You've been lying to me for months, and you expect me to just... What? Forgive you?" Lisa stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. "Sarah, I'm so sorry. I never meant for this to happen. You have to believe me." "Believe you?" Sarah said, her voice shaking with rage. "You've been sleeping with my husband, and you want me to believe you. The only thing I believe is that I've been a fool to trust either of you." Lisa broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. But Sarah felt no sympathy. Her fury was the only thing keeping her from collapsing into despair. "I want you out of my house," Sarah said to Lisa, her voice cold and resolute. "Pack your things and leave. Today." "Sarah, please," Lisa begged. "Let me explain." "There's nothing to explain," Sarah shouted. "You betrayed me, Lisa. You're not my friend. You're nothing to me anymore." Ethan tried to intervene. "Sarah, let's not make any rash decisions." "Rash decisions?" Sarah interrupted. "You think kicking her out is rash? You think expecting you to be faithful is rash? The only rash decision I made was trusting either of you." Lisa retreated to the guest room to pack her things, leaving Sarah and Ethan alone in the kitchen. The silence was deafening. "I never wanted this to happen," Ethan said quietly. "But it did," Sarah replied, her voice hollow. "And now we have to deal with the fallout." Ethan reached for her hand, but she pulled away. "Don't," she said, her voice breaking. "You don't get to comfort me. Not now." For the rest of the day, Sarah avoided Ethan. She couldn't bear to look at him, let alone talk to him. When Lisa finally left, dragging her suitcase behind her, Sarah felt a brief sense of relief, but it was quickly replaced by the weight of everything that had been lost. That night, Sarah sat alone in the living room, staring at the flickering glow of the TV without really seeing it. Ethan entered the room hesitantly, sitting on the edge of the couch. "Sarah, I'm sorry," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know," she replied, her eyes still fixed on the screen. "But sorry doesn't fix this." Ethan nodded, his shoulders slumping. "I want to make this right," he said. Sarah finally turned to look at him, her eyes filled with tears. "I don't know if you can," she said. For the first time, Ethan looked truly broken. "I love you," he said softly. Sarah shook her head, a bitter smile on her lips. "If you loved me, you wouldn't have done this." The weight of his betrayal hung heavy in the air between them, an unspoken reminder of everything they had lost. The days following the revelation were a blur of raw emotion. Sarah felt as though her world had been dismantled piece by piece, leaving behind an aching void where trust and love once resided. The house, once filled with laughter and warmth, now felt cold and suffocating. Every corner seemed to echo with memories she could no longer cherish. Ethan tried to talk to her, but Sarah avoided him. She wasn't ready. Not to forgive, not to forget, not even to fight. Each time she heard his footsteps approach, she felt a pang of anxiety and anger, a visceral reminder of his betrayal. On the second day after Lisa's departure, Ethan finally cornered Sarah in the kitchen. His voice was pleading, his eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. "We can get through this," he said, his voice cracking. "I know I've messed up, but I'll do whatever it takes to fix this." Sarah stared at him, her expression blank. "Fix this?" she repeated, her voice devoid of emotion. "You can't fix something that's broken beyond repair." Ethan flinched at her words, but didn't back down. "I'll go to counseling. I'll quit work if I have to. I don't want to lose you." Sarah shook her head, her eyes brimming with tears. "You already lost me, Ethan. The moment you chose her over us, you lost me." Unable to stay in the house with him, Sarah decided to leave for a while. She packed a small bag and drove to her sister's house in the next town. Her sister, Emily, welcomed her with open arms, offering her a refuge from the storm that had become her life. For the first few days, Sarah didn't speak much. She spent hours sitting on Emily's porch, staring at the horizon and trying to make sense of her feelings. Anger, betrayal, sadness. They all swirled together, leaving her exhausted and numb. Emily didn't push her to talk, but one evening, as they shared a bottle of wine, Sarah finally broke down. "How could he do this to me?" she sobbed, tears streaming down her face. "I gave him everything, my love, my trust, my life, and it wasn't enough." Emily pulled her into a hug, her own eyes glistening with tears. "It's not your fault, Sarah. You didn't deserve this. He made the choice to betray you, and that's on him, not you." Meanwhile, back at home, Ethan was grappling with his own guilt. The house felt empty without Sarah, a constant reminder of what he had thrown away. He replayed their last conversation over and over in his mind, haunted by the look in her eyes when she said, "You already lost me." Meanwhile, back at home, Ethan was grappling with his own guilt. The house felt empty without Sarah, a constant reminder of what he had thrown away. He replayed their last conversation over and over in his mind, haunted by the look in her eyes when she said, "You already lost me." Desperate to make amends, Ethan reached out to a marriage counselor and scheduled an appointment. He called Sarah and left her a voicemail, begging her to come home and promising to do whatever it took to rebuild their relationship. But Sarah wasn't ready to face him yet. She listened to his voicemail, her heart aching at the sound of his voice, but she didn't call him back. Instead, she focused on herself for the first time in years. She took long walks, journaled her thoughts, and started seeing a therapist to help her process the pain. One day, while scrolling through her phone, Sarah came across a photo of her and Ethan from their honeymoon. They looked so happy, so in love, and the memory brought a fresh wave of tears. How had they gone from that to this? When Sarah finally returned home after 2 weeks, Ethan was waiting for her. He looked thinner, his face etched with worry. "Thank you for coming back," he said softly, his eyes searching hers for any sign of hope. "I didn't come back for you," Sarah replied, her voice firm. "I came back for me. This is my home too, and I won't let your mistakes drive me away from it." Ethan nodded, his shoulders slumping. "I understand, but I'm still going to fight for us. I don't care how long it takes." Sarah didn't respond. She wasn't sure if there was an us left to fight for. In the weeks that followed, they navigated an uneasy coexistence. Ethan threw himself into therapy, attending individual sessions as well as the marriage counseling appointments Sarah reluctantly agreed to. The sessions were emotionally draining, forcing them to confront the pain, anger, and resentment that had festered between them. There were moments when Sarah thought she could see a glimmer of the man she had fallen in love with. But there were also moments when the weight of his betrayal felt too heavy to bear. One evening, during a particularly tense counseling session, Sarah finally voiced the question that had been haunting her. "Why her?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What did she have that I didn't?" Ethan looked down at his hands, his face filled with regret. "It wasn't about her," he said quietly. "It was about me. I felt lost, insecure, like I wasn't enough. And instead of talking to you about it, I took the coward's way out." His words brought Sarah little comfort. The damage was done, and no explanation could undo it. But for the first time, she saw a flicker of accountability in his eyes, a willingness to confront his flaws and take responsibility for his actions. As the weeks turned into months, Sarah found herself at a crossroads. The wounds were still raw, and the road to healing felt impossibly long. She didn't know if she could ever fully forgive Ethan, but she also wasn't ready to walk away from the life they had built together. The fallout of their choices had left their marriage in ruins, but amid the wreckage, there was a sliver of hope, a chance, however slim, to rebuild. Months passed, and the raw edges of Sarah's pain began to dull, though the scars of betrayal remained etched in her heart. The journey had been anything but smooth. Every counseling session felt like an uphill battle, every day a struggle to navigate the fragile coexistence she and Ethan had established. Yet, amidst the turmoil, Sarah began to find moments of clarity. She started to reclaim her sense of self, rediscovering the parts of her identity she had buried under the weight of being a wife, a friend, and a caregiver. She took up painting again, losing herself in colors and textures that gave her an outlet for emotions too complex to put into words. Ethan, too, was changing. He no longer made excuses for his actions, instead choosing to confront the flaws and insecurities that had led him down such a destructive path. He listened more, spoke less, and gave Sarah the space she needed, even when it hurt him to do so. One evening, as they sat across from each other in the counselor's office, their therapist posed a question that hung heavily in the air. "Do you believe this marriage is worth saving?" Sarah looked at Ethan, her heart heavy with conflicting emotions. She thought of the years they had spent together, the good times, the laughter, the love that once felt unshakable. But she also thought of the pain, the lies, and the trust that had been shattered. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice trembling, "but I'm willing to try. For now." It wasn't the answer Ethan had hoped for, but it was more than he expected. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said quietly, his voice filled with determination. As the weeks turned into months, their lives began to take on a new rhythm. It wasn't the same as before. Nothing could erase what had happened. But it was a start. They set boundaries, attended counseling regularly, and worked on rebuilding trust, one small step at a time. Sarah also started setting goals for herself, separate from Ethan. She enrolled in a local art class and made new friends, determined not to lose herself in the process of healing their marriage. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of independence and self-worth that wasn't tied to anyone else. Despite their progress, there were moments when the past threatened to pull them under. A forgotten voicemail, an unexpected memory, or a sleepless night could bring back the pain with startling clarity. But each time, they chose to face it together, leaning on the fragile bond they were slowly rebuilding. One night, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Ethan reached for Sarah's hand. She hesitated for a moment before letting him take it, the warmth of his touch both familiar and foreign. "I know I can't undo what I've done," Ethan said softly, "but I want you to know that I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be the man you deserve." Sarah didn't respond immediately. She watched the sky turn shades of orange and pink, her thoughts as tumultuous as the clouds above. Finally, she turned to him, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and caution. "I'm not asking you to be perfect, Ethan," she said. "I'm asking you to be honest. With me, with yourself. That's the only way this can work." Ethan nodded, his grip on her hand tightening slightly. "I promise," he said, and for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt the faint stirrings of belief. As the evening wore on, Sarah reflected on everything she had learned from the ordeal. She realized that healing wasn't just about forgiving Ethan, it was about forgiving herself, too, for not seeing the signs, for staying silent when she should have spoken up, for believing that she could control what was never hers to control. The experience had reshaped her understanding of love, trust, and boundaries. She learned that love wasn't just about sacrifice, it was about mutual respect and accountability. Trust, once broken, could be rebuilt, but only with time, effort, and unwavering honesty. And boundaries weren't walls to shut people out. They were lines to protect what mattered most. In the end, Sarah knew there were no guarantees. The future was uncertain, and the road ahead would be long and challenging. But for the first time in months, she felt a glimmer of hope, not just for her marriage, but for herself. As she and Ethan sat together in the fading light, she realized that the story of their marriage wasn't over. It had been rewritten, scarred but still standing, with a new chapter waiting to be written. What would you do if faced with a betrayal like Sarah's? Could trust ever be rebuilt? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear from you. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more gripping stories of love, betrayal, and redemption. Hit the notification bell so you never miss what's coming next. You won't believe the twists and turns in the stories we have lined up.